In this video, we'll continue our discussion on JavaFX basics, and we'll look at how you can create different kinds of layouts, and we'll look at the different layout panes that are available. So in the previous video, we saw that we can use the base class pane to lay out multiple nodes on it. It has a getChildren method to fetch the collection of nodes that's available, and onto that collection you can add new nodes. So it's always possible that when you create the pane for the first time, that collection is empty, but then you basically you can add more nodes onto it, and that's what we saw in our previous examples. So we can have some specialized panes like the stack pane, wherein the nodes are stacking one on top of the other, and it happens in the center of the pane. There's a flow pane wherein the nodes are basically either row by row in a horizontal fashion they're arranged, or they're arranged column by column vertically. And then we can specify that whether we want it horizontally or vertically. Then we have the grid pane, wherein the nodes are all placed in cells in a two-dimensional grid. There's border pane. This is when you want certain nodes to appear either in the top region of the window, or in the bottom, or in the left or right, or in the center. If there's a specific area where you want it to appear, then you can use the border pane and specify the top, whether you want a top, right, bottom, left, or center. Then there's HBox and VBox. This is basically a way to place all of the nodes in a single row. In HBox, they are placed in a single row horizontally, and in VBox, they are placed in a single column. So basically, you will see them appear vertically. So these are some of the different ones that's available. So here's here's the API for flow pane, and it has different multiple constructors, and as you can see in the constructor, we specify the orientation of the flow, how we want the flow to look. So this is a grid pane, wherein we are now arranging it on a grid, on a two-dimensional grid. So here we have the example of show grid pane Java file. So let's quickly take a look at it to see how the nodes are arranged in the grid. So here we're starting out by creating a grid pane object, and then we're setting its alignment position to center. We're setting some basics like its padding and H gap and V gap, so that based on that the pane gets generated with all those paddings and alignment. Then onto the pane, we're basically adding all of our nodes. So say we are adding a label and a text field, and then we're adding another label and a text field. So we're basically adding first name, and then the first name, and then the corresponding text field for it, then the middle initial and the corresponding text field for it, and then the last name and the text field. So now this gets arranged onto a two-dimensional grid. So basically, and then we're also adding a button, an add button, onto the pane. Once this entire grid pane is arranged, it's then placed on the scene, and the stage is displayed. So let's run this to see how the grid looks. So here's how the grid looks. So basically, you will see that in the first column we have all of our labels, and in the second column we have all the text fields, and they're nicely aligned because of placing them on the grid pane. So the border pane is again similar to that. You basically have to specify the location for the border pane. Let's look at this example, the show border pane example. So here we are basically creating a new pane object, and then we're creating custom panes. So in order to show how these different panes look, what we're going to do is we're going to use what's a custom pane, which extends our regular stack pane. So on that, we're setting the style, we're setting the border color of the pane to red, and then we're setting some padding options, and then we're also whatever is passed to the custom pane constructor, we use that as the title, and it's displayed as a label on the pane. So next what we're going to do is we're going to on the border pane, we're going to basically place all of the nodes. We're going to place a new custom pane on the top, and then another new custom pane to the right, another new custom pane to the bottom, and then one to the left and one in the center. So you'll get to see how all of these different panes are arranged on the window. And then once all of these panes are arranged, we are basically adding it to the scene and displaying the stage. So let's take a look at the show border pane application. Okay, here you go. So as you can see, here's the top, then the one at the bottom, there's one at the right, left, and then the center. And all of them, each of them is a custom pane, and that's why they have the red border color. So like I mentioned, there's also HBox and VBox, which will basically allow you to either add all the nodes in a single row, or the VBox will basically allow to add everything in a single column. So there's an example to demonstrate both HBox and VBox called show HBox VBox. So let's look at that Java file. Okay, here it is. So in this case, what we're doing is we're creating a border pane so that we can add HBox at the top and VBox to the left, and then we can look at how both of them look. So what we're doing is we're writing two methods, get HBox and get VBox. So in the get HBox, we're creating an HBox object with a certain padding, 15 set as the padding. We're setting its style, its background color to gold, and then onto it we're adding the nodes, two buttons, one called computer science and the other one is chemistry, and then we're also adding an image. Now because this is an HBox, they should all get aligned horizontally, and then we're returning the HBox object, which is then getting placed on the pane in the top part of the pane. Then similarly, we are creating a VBox object wherein we are basically adding labels to it, and they should get arranged because it's a VBox. They should get arranged vertically, and then this VBox object is basically set on the pane to the left hand side. So let's run this. Okay, here it is. So the top part that you see with the background gold color is our HBox. So there's the two buttons and the flag. They're all arranged horizontally in a single row, and we set it to the top of the pane, so that's the reason they're appearing at the top of the pane. Then we created a VBox and placed it on the left hand side of the pane, and because it's a VBox and it had labels basically, so all of the labels are being displayed vertically in this case, as you can see in this UI. So there's also a number of different shapes that you can draw. One of the shapes that we already saw was a circle. As you can see, they're all being inherited from the shape interface. So so these are basically the specializations. There's text, you can draw text, line, rectangle, circle, ellipse, arc, polygon, and polyline. So all of these shapes are available. So when you create a text, basically you can specify the x coordinate and y coordinate of the text, and then provide the text value. So there's multiple constructors using which you can create this object. So here's an example of text. So basically the xy coordinates that are specified is where the text will will begin basically. And then you can also specify additional style for the text, like as you can see in here, the first one is in bold, the second one is in regular text, and the third one is in striked out format. So let me show you an example of show text. So here's the show text example. So again, we're creating a regular pane and then creating a text object on it. We're creating multiple text objects, text 1, 2, and 3, and then adding some text to it. We're also specifying the xy coordinates of where it should start. As you can see, the first one starts at 2020, the second one at 60, and the third one at 10 and 100. And then we're also specifying specific fonts for it. So the first one is in Courier, bold, italics and size 15, whereas the second one is just in the default, and the third one is has a fill color of red. It has an underline set, it has a strike through set. So that's the reason when we execute it, we'll see all of this these font effects on it. So here are the three text objects that were created. As you can see, the first one is slightly to the left because its starting XY coordinates were I think set to 2020. The second one is a little indented, and the third one is again towards the left. And the corresponding font attributes that were specified are displayed in here. So there's also, you can create a line object. So with the line object, basically you have to specify the starting XY coordinates as well as the ending XY coordinates, and that's what's passed to the constructor when you want the line object created. So in the samples folder, there is a show line example that demonstrates that. So in a similar manner, you can create a rectangle. Again, the rectangle takes in the width and height of the rectangle, as well as the upper left corner of where you want it to start being drawn. So you specify that upper left corner, and then the height and the width, and then the rectangle is displayed accordingly. A circle, we already saw it. You have to specify the center XY coordinates, and then the radius. So that's that constructor there. That's what we used. Now when nothing is specified, then an empty circle is created, or a circle with minimal radius, with the default radius at a specified center is created when you use the second constructor. Ellipse is a little different. So again, with ellipse, you have to specify the center XY coordinates, and then the radius Y and radius X. So multiple things have to be specified, and then that creates the ellipse. Let me quickly show you the show ellipse example. So here's the show ellipse, wherein we are initially setting up the stage, and onto the scene we are adding a new my ellipse object. So here we are creating our own a custom class called my ellipse, which extends a pane, and on that you see that we are creating multiple. So there's a for loop to create multiple ellipses. And then in each iteration of the for loop, something about the ellipses properties changes, so that we can get a different kind of display. So let me execute this first to show you how it looks. So here it is. So there's 16 ellipses because we saw that there was a for loop, and in the for loop we were creating 16 ellipse objects, and basically based on the radius X and radius Y values, we're changing it by a little bit so that the angle of the ellipse changes, and then we're using a random function in there to change the color, the color with which the ellipse is drawn, the stroke color. So and that's the reason the output looks that way. So as you can see in here, the set stroke, we are basically using map.random to generate the red, blue and green colors. So we're passing a color object to set stroke, but we're randomly generating that color object. Then set fill is set to white. We're basically creating the ellipse with, actually the ellipse is created with the same center and the same X radius and Y radius. The only difference is that for each iteration it's being rotated a little bit. The ellipse is being rotated a little bit, and that's the reason you see the arrangement that you saw. And then after each iteration, the ellipse that was created is being added to the collection, node collection. The get children is basically providing us that collection. So that's how you see the UI that was generated, which is over here. Next, you can also create an arc. So again, there's the arc class, and it has its constructors, which shows the basically the center XY, and then the angle, and how much you want it to be open. So here's some examples. Basically, we have to specify the start angle of where the arc starts, as well as the ending angle, and then we also have to specify the length. And there is the show arc example that you can refer to if you need to draw arcs. Then you can also create polygons and polylines. So what that means is now there's going to be multiple points. There's multiple points in the polygon, so you have to specify all of those xy coordinates in order for the polygon to be generated. So so basically there is a get points method that basically keeps track of all of the xy coordinates of the points. So there is a show polygon example. Let me quickly open that. So here it is. Again, in this case, what we are doing is to the scene we are adding a custom polygon, and we have a custom class called myPolygon that extends pane, and in here we're creating a polygon object, setting its fill color and stroke color, and then creating the list of points. So we're basically going to add to that list by, and that's what this loop, the for loop, is doing over here. It's generating the values, the xy values that go into the list for the different points on the polygon, and then it's adding it to the collection, the node collection that's already there. Okay, here's how the UI looks for the polygon code that we just saw. Finally, we'll look at a case study of a clock pane, of how you can create a custom pane, and the purpose of this one is specifically to display a clock. So the clock pane is the constructor takes in the hour, minute and second, and then creates the pane based on that. You can set the width and the height of the pane, and then provide it with a current time. And once the clock pane is created, then we basically use that pane to display a clock. So I'll show you the display clock program, which in turn uses the clock pane. So here's the display clock. So what we're doing is we're creating a clock object by using the clock pane class, and I'll show that to you in a little bit. And then we are basically creating a string called time string and constructing the time based on the clock's hour, the colon the minute, and colon the second. So we're using the get methods on it to retrieve those values, and then we're creating a label and placing this string onto it so that the time is displayed. Then we're creating a border pane, and to the center we want to in the border pane we're using the center area, and we're going to place the clock in the center, and then the scene is set and it's placed on the stage, and the stage is displayed. The clock pane class is here. So basically it has the data fields hour, minute and second to keep track of it. It sets the current time, and then it has the getters and setters for all of these data fields. So the set current time method basically uses a Gregorian calendar, and it uses the minute, hour and second values to set the time, and then it paints the clock. So now you can see the paint clock itself. The way it is done is it's calculating a clock radius by using the width and height of the pane, and then it's creating a circle object that's going to be a clock, and it's setting its fill and stroke colors, and it's also setting the text values, because along on the clock we want to display the hour numbers, and then it needs to draw the second hand and the minute hand and the hour hand. So that's where it's using the line object. It's using the line object and creating those lines by specifying the coordinates. So let's take a look at the clock display. So here's how the output looks. So we have the clock pane, which is this central part on the window. So a circle is drawn, and then the 12, 3, 6 and 9 are displayed, and then the hour, minute and second hands in different color are displayed, and then whatever the time is also shown as a label at the bottom. So here we've made use of a custom pane class called the clock pane class in order to generate this UI. So I hope these examples will be useful in creating graphical user interfaces using Java. In a follow-on video, we'll show how you can do event-driven programming along with JavaFX elements. Thank you.